Welcome. Today I'm going to talk about karma, spiritual practice, and spiritual liberation. So in order to understand yoga and the traditional reasons why people would practice yoga, we need to talk a little bit about some of the metaphysical concepts associated with the yoga tradition. According to the yoga tradition, everybody has three bodies. You have a physical body, which is composed of matter, flesh, bone, blood, what have you. You have a subtle body, which is composed of vital energy called prana and mind. And you have a causal body, which is composed of subtle impressions from past actions and experiences. Those subtle impressions are called samskaras. So the closest analogy to the causal body that can be found in Western psychology is the subconscious mind. So when we have experiences or we perform actions repeatedly, then over time there begin to be patterns that are worn into the subconscious and memories that are stored in the subconscious. And those begin to shape our experience of reality and the way that we live our lives in very powerful ways. So there's a metaphor that can be used like rainwater washing down the side of a mountain, and it begins to form a stream, and over time that stream begins to wear deeper and deeper grooves into the side of the mountain. And when that has been happening for long enough, then eventually a river forms, and it is really difficult for water to flow down the mountain in any other way than through the groove that has been worn. And likewise, when we as human beings begin to perform actions consistently and repeatedly over time, we begin to wear these grooves in the subconscious, in the causal body really, that begin to shape the way that we think, the way that we act and react to stimuli. So if the rainwater is a metaphor for some kind of stimulus from our environment or an emotion that arises or what have you, then when we are stimulated in a particular way, our past actions and experiences begin to determine the way that we habitually respond. And that can become a compulsion in some cases. When those habit patterns are really, really deeply ingrained, then the samskara becomes what's called a vasana, which means a coloring. So we can think of this in terms of another metaphor being a reel film. So with a film reel, there's frames that are on the film, and then that is displayed in front of a projector. So the projector is like the light of universal consciousness, and in all universes there's only one light when it really comes down to it. But that light gets filtered through all these different films, which are the subtle impressions in the causal bodies of billions and billions and trillions of beings in countless universes. And all of those subtle impressions interact with each other and project into an experience, an appearance of a universe that we live in. Now, according to the metaphysics of yoga, the samskaras, the subtle impressions in the causal body, are latent seeds which eventually sprout and grow and bear fruit. So it's like a fundamental law of physics that says that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. So if I punch my friend, then whether it's this lifetime or 100 lifetimes from now, there has been a subtle impression that has been implanted in my causal body that is going to cause my friend to punch me at some point. Now, you don't necessarily have to believe in karma in order to practice yoga, or in energy even, or samskaras as something different than neural pathways or the subconscious. But in order to contextualize yoga, it is necessary to understand the traditional teachings about this. And I personally do believe in these teachings because my life experience has borne them out. So when we are living in the world, under most circumstances, people are aware of 3 different states of consciousness. Those are waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. According to the Shiva Sutra, waking consciousness is the state of consciousness which is primarily sense-based. So it's where our senses are connecting to objective phenomena outside of ourselves, outside of our individual selves. Dreaming is a mental construct. So it's similar to samskaras. So basically, when we go to sleep, these subtle subconscious impressions project into lived experiences of dream realities. But that also means that even when we would normally consider ourselves awake, but we're daydreaming or are letting our minds run wild, then that is also dreaming according to this tradition. And then deep sleep is a state of non-discernment. So it is a state in which we still have a sense of individual existence on a subconscious level that differentiates us from universal consciousness, but we're not discerning discrete objects of experience. In the yoga tradition, there is also what's called turiya, which means the 4th. So beyond these 3 states, there's also a 4th state of consciousness. It's also called samadhi sometimes. We could translate this as superconsciousness or as ego death, but basically it is a state in which our sense of individual identity completely dissolves into universal consciousness and bliss. There are a lot of stories of sages in India and recorded evidence, really, of people in India who have gone into samadhi and have basically gone into a hypostatic state, which means that they were not breathing very much, hardly at all, not eating very much for days on end. It was almost like their body was beginning to die, or like they were dead, but that their body wasn't decaying. It was just in hypostasis for an extended period. And then when they returned, they describe being in a state of bliss and union. So this state, samadhi, turiya, is often the end goal of many forms of yoga. And in the Yoga Sutra, a text which was written about 200 BCE, before Tantra arose, there is a verse that describes yoga in these terms. Verse 1-2. Yogash chitta vritti narodaha. That means yoga is the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind. So if we think of the mind as like waves on the surface of an ocean of universal consciousness, then when those waves dissolve back into the ocean, then our awareness can dissolve back into the ocean. And that's samadhi. So in various tantric traditions, there is also a teaching about a 5th state of consciousness called turiyatita, which means beyond the 4th. So if the 4th state is a state of spiritual death, then the 5th state is a state of spiritual rebirth. So this is where universal consciousness is drawn back down into manifestation after it's the complete dissolution of the individual identity. That identity is reborn in an awakened state where that person becomes directly aware of the fundamental basis of all reality as this absolutely blissful, loving presence and light. So, when we practice yoga, that is the ultimate goal, is this embodied superconsciousness. It's a state in which superconsciousness is carried throughout all four states, basically. Whether you're waking, you're dreaming, you're sleeping, or you're dead, you're still superconscious. So, in yoga, there are different methodologies and techniques to help us to steady our minds and to dissolve our awareness into this universal consciousness. And those methods are described in the Yoga Sutra in verses 112 through 114. Abhyasa vairagyabhyam tanirodha tatrasti tao yatno bhyasaha satu dirghakala nairantarya satkara sevito dhrita bhumihi. That means dissolution of those cognitive fluctuations occurs through practice and non-attachment. Practice is consistent effort to attain steadiness. That practice which is endowed with true devotion for a long time has a firm foundation. So what this section of the Yoga Sutra is saying is that there are these two words, abhyasa, which means practice, and vairagya, which we translate as non-attachment. And those are the means of attaining samadhi. So in this particular context, practice is an effort to attain steadiness. And this is usually interpreted as steadiness of mind. So an ability to focus in one direction for an extended period and to become calm and clear and present. And that practice, which is endowed with true devotion for a long time, has a firm foundation. So that means that you are devoted to your practice. It has some kind of spiritual quality that opens your heart and which you enjoy and which you do consistently on a daily basis for a long time. So it is extremely difficult to enter into these superconscious states if you just practice once in a while, or even if you practice for extended periods once or twice a week. That is less effective than practicing for, say, 10 or 20 minutes every single day. Because when the 10 or 20 minutes is done every single day, over time you begin to develop a samskara, and that same samskara is not ingrained in the same way if you just practice every once in a while. So the other word that was mentioned is vairagya, which means non-attachment, and that is explained in verse 115. Drishtanu shravika vishaya vitrishnaya vashikara sagnya vairagyam, which means non-attachment is unified willpower granting freedom from craving for objects seen and heard. So through discipline, through consistent practice, we begin to develop this unified willpower, this ability to engage in a certain lifestyle that is promoting health for ourselves and others, and to complete the tasks that we undertake and to follow, the true wisdom and love and compassion that exists within the depths of our being, rather than our transient cravings and desires for limited objects. So desire is not entirely bad, especially in the tantric tradition. We are taught that desire can be a means of liberation, but it can lead to a lot of suffering, especially if we are desiring and craving things that are unhealthy for ourselves and cause harm to the environment or to other beings. So we are taught in yoga to develop a healthy attachment, a wholesome attachment, and really an inner attachment, which means that for our practice, if we become attached to being aware, or if we become attached to the divine, however you may conceptualize that, or you become attached to the process of yoga, that kind of attachment is healthy and will help to lead to these awakened states, whereas other forms of attachment might lead us away from them. Om.